next speaker is Mr. Stephen Welch, Administration and Communication Consultant, who will speak on the topic, Communicating the Culture of Reform, Public Sector and Public Opinion.
Thank you very much. I want to just say a little bit about myself, and then in the next 15 minutes, give you some ideas and approaches to addressing some of the communication challenges that we've been talking about. So my name is Stephen Welch. I'm an independent consultant, and I'm here really for a couple of reasons. One, thank you for the invitation, but over the past year or so, I've been doing some work with some of your colleagues here, and for example, the Cyprus Academy of Public Administration around training in communication and change management. And that's a lot of the work I do in the UK. I'm also here as a representative of the International Association of Business Communicators, which is the world's largest association of professional communicators. And we do a lot of work globally around establishing the profession, helping communicators grow their skills, and providing career development and approaches for communications. So I'm going to talk about some of that as well. What I really want to do, though, is give you some ideas and approaches of communicating in this new era and how we can overcome some of the challenges of traditional government or indeed traditional organizational communication. And I think I also want to hope to inspire you a little bit, because great communication is all around us, and so is bad communication. And just in the last 24 hours, I've come across several examples, which I will show you in a minute, of good and bad communication. And for me, this is important because those everyday things inspire me in my job around training, in my job as a communicator. And I'd really encourage you to think about when you see good or bad examples of not just government communication, but public communication or organizational communication. And these can inspire you to change the way you think about communication and what you do. One of the challenges of particularly government communication is around getting people to act and behave in a different way, getting them to do something they might not have done. So I just want to ask a question to start off with, was how many of you in the last week have participated in a government-directed change program? No. One, maybe. Okay, let me ask another question. How many of you in the last week changed your clocks from summertime to normal time last weekend? So, this is a change program, so I'm guessing led by the government, or at least the European Union, and yet everybody participated in this program. And everybody changed your behavior. You got up 1 hour later. The offices of government and organizations opened 1 hour later. And we did it without really thinking about it, without really questioning whether we should do it or not. It's become a social norm to do that. Can you imagine if everybody was doing it and you were the only person who said, nope, I'm not going to change my clocks. I'm still going to say 1 hour ahead of everybody else. People would think you're a bit strange. And so one of the challenges of organizational communication is creating an environment where new behavior is seen as the norm. And a friend, a guy called Warren Hatter, he's a great behavioral scientist. And he did a great article around, imagine if it was a brand new government policy to change the clocks by 1 hour. What would actually happen? And he did a bit of a joke article, which was along the lines of, well, we're going to implement the new 1 hour delay policy to align with our special light use strategy developed in accordance with government policy. And we're asking all citizens to participate in this strategy by delaying your getting up time by 1 hour. And by the way, you all need to do some activity at home, i.e. change the clocks, but we're not going to provide any training or government support for you to do this. You have to do it all by yourself. And we kind of laugh, and yes, it's a bit of a joke, but I think there are ways in which communication, both by governments and organizations, can help us think about what is socially normal behavior or get people to be working and acting in a different way. And so what are some of the tools and techniques that we see around that, and how do you get people behaving in a way which is different to what they were, interacting with government in a different way to before, or changing their purchasing behavior or the way in which they use services? What can you do? And I've got some examples, but the first thing I want to pick up on is something that was mentioned earlier, which is about communication. Who is communication for? When we're communicating about something, who is the audience? Who is it for? And Alex was talking about changing behavior, getting citizens to operate in a different way. And when I do a lot of work with large companies and organizations, they would say, well, we're communicating so that people will buy our products or they'll work harder or whatever. And they think about the audience of the communication. But I see a lot of really bad communication in my job. And you often see 4 different types of communication in organizations. The first type is the actual audience of the communication is the writer. You do it for your own satisfaction. You like writing. It's something you're interested in. You're blogging about subjects which are of interest to you. The writer is the target. It's like a self-communication. That's fine. It has its place. But it's not really going to get behavioral change or people to act in a different way. The second type of communication I often see, and this applies, I think, to a lot of the work I see in the public sector, but also in the private sector, is that the audience of the communication is the person's boss. And they're writing the thing to please their boss, to make their boss look like a busy person, to make their boss look good, to keep them active, to show that they're in the profile. And so the audience there is really the boss. And that's typically not the real audience of the communication. And we've all been in the situation, I am sure, where somebody in a higher position than us says, please write about what I've been up to, or please release an announcement, show me shaking hands with somebody important. And this type of communication is really aimed at making the boss look happy, making the boss happy. It's not really aimed at the target audience. The third type of communication is a bit of what we were saying earlier about, well, I must do some communication to show that I'm doing something. I must do, if I can just show a list of things I've produced, surely that's my job. And that's the sort of sending out stuff. That's the, I'm just going to produce things for the sake of it, so that at the end of the year when I have my review or my performance appraisal, I can say, look at all these things I did. That's not really communication at all. That's just activity and production. But it's really the fourth type of communication which is important, and it's communication which is aimed at the audience. I did some work a couple of years ago for a kind of public savings cooperative credit union type of thing. And my client wanted to produce something to communicate with all the employees in the various branches. And she'd done her research, and she discovered that the majority of the people in the branches were, part-time workers, often middle-aged women, many housewives who wanted a part-time job. And their interests were around domestic things and a bit of celebrity news and some what's on TV, as well as some important corporate things. And so she produced a magazine which was aimed at that target audience. Went to the board, full of middle-aged men in suits, and they said, oh, this is terrible. We hate it. It's ridiculous. Why would we have all this sort of women's style magazine? We're important people. We don't like this, is very bad. And she said, to her credit, she said, I'm glad you hate it, because if you'd liked it, I would have had a big problem, because you're not my target audience. And if you like it, I've made a big mistake. And so she was very able to stand up and challenge her senior people. And to their credit, they recognized and they said, well, yes, okay, I understand. You've done the research, you've investigated. If you think it's the right thing to do, we hate it, but we'll trust you and we'll go with it. And so she was brave to stand up to them, and they were brave to actually sort of override their instincts and let go of something which they actually hated. But it worked out well because it was aimed at the target audience, and it was communication aimed at the audience. The other thing I want to talk about is the human-to-human aspect of communication. I'm guessing most of you in the room are human. I'm guessing most of the time your target audience is a human, and that the person you're communicating, or the public, or the population, is human. So what we're talking about here is a human-to-human communication. It's not some kind of robot communication. It's not some kind of strange organization or government to public communication. It's human to human. And yet somehow, wherever I go around the world, people have this sort of cloak of organizational jargon they put on, and they say, no, I mustn't use simple language. Please, I need some complicated words to put into my communication. Some long words would be great too. And if I can make a sentence which is 57 words long, that's fantastic. And communication is not some kind of Delphic oracle of mysterious utterings coming out of the belly button of the organization. It's about human to human. And when I see communication which is in that cloak of organizational jargon or full of technical language, it really annoys me because that's not effective. It's not aimed at the target audience. It's making the writer feel good, or making the boss feel good, or, oh, look, I can use some big words. And so what I would really encourage you to do is remember that your communication is about human to human. And I have a little saying which is about, let's put the public back into public relations. So I want to give you some examples and some tips. And like I said earlier, these are all things which have inspired me over the last 24 hours to think about effective communication. And they're really in three categories. The first one is personalization. When you're a communicator, you're not just a corporate parrot. Or if you work in journalism, your job is not just to kind of copy, paste things. It's really about thinking about the issues, injecting a bit of yourself and your own personality into the issues, being a bit of yourself while maintaining the standard that's expected of you. So I want a little bit to know about you. I want it to be a bit personal. And if there's a little flavor of who you are and what you do creeps in, that's really great too. So here's an example I found on the airplane on the way over, the magazine, British Airways magazine, talking about one of the cabin service directors. This guy talking about his job and customer service angle. And some really interesting things that really make him to be a person. Number one is he compares himself to a mafia don, the capo di capi of the crew. And so, sorry, British Airways, mafia? What's with that? But you get a sort of flavor of what the guy's like. And then he says, yes, well, I've learned some languages, but I lost count of the times I've spoken to someone in German only for them to look up and say, I'm from the Netherlands. So you get a feel of the guy who's being a bit personal, professional, expert, well-trained, no doubt about that. But you get a feel for who he is as an individual. So this is an example of personalization in communication. Communicators are not parrots. Their job is to get the message across, and if they can give a little bit of themselves or tell a little bit about who they are, then that's really important. So personalization. The second one is around my example of the time change when we all changed our clocks back. There's a little bit of peer pressure there. You're not going to be the only one to not do it. If you show up at work an hour early on Monday because you forgot to do it, everyone's going to laugh at you. So there's a social norm and the peer pressure of this. And I think the masters of this are hotels. This is a sign from my hotel room, which I've stolen. Dear guest, think about the environment. Don't wash your towel unnecessarily. If you want to use it again, put it back on the rack and we'll all save the environment. It's great. Nice message. Obviously the hotel saves lots of money by not having to clean the towels, but no news of that. They don't say, help us save money. No, it's an appeal to the environment. The best one I ever saw of these was I was in a hotel once and it said, dear guest, welcome to room 316. In the last year, 91% of guests in this room recycled their towels, putting this room in the top 5 of all rooms in the hotel. Well, I better not let this side down, it's a competition here. Yeah, I better recycle my towel. Now, just think about that for a minute. So it is a competition a little bit. It's appealing to my sense of competition, and I've got quite a good one. Top 5, right? We can help. We can help room 316. Hold on a second. I'm on a team with a room, and I'm helping the room to win the competition. What? And who's on my team? Oh, other people have used this room in last year. Don't know who they are. Never met them. Never will. It's like, how can this be a team? These strangers who I don't know, we're all competing on behalf of the room so it can win against other rooms. It makes no logical sense, and yet the concept of peer pressure and the way in which I want to help the room win the competition, what does it get as a prize? I don't know. great, extra towels. But it's that sense of peer pressure and feeling part of a community of other people who are doing similar things. So my second one is peer pressure and the population thing. And then the last one, which goes back to my human-to-human thing, is around persuasion and the clear language. These are two adverts which I came across, both for corporate IT services. This one is all about SharePoint, very, very exciting subject, made even more exciting by the text. Our solution delivery experts will ensure your organization is totally in sync. Now our successful pre-packaged and pre-built solutions based on our business services, blueprint, and roadmap Salem. This is the corporate speak. This is the cloak of corporate jargon. This is the Delphi Oracle speaking things and needs an interpreter to understand what they are. Maybe you can explain what it means to me. This is communication which is not written for the audience. This is written to please someone's boss or someone showing off with their long words. I'm sure they're a very good company, by the way, but they need some training in copywriting. The second example is about private cloud IT services. So putting all your data, in the cloud, on the internet. How do you access it? Oh, it's a bit confusing. I don't know. I don't really understand this cloud concept. Is my data getting mixed up with other people's data? It's all very unclear. What do I do? So they've summarized it like this. Here's the public cloud. Everyone's data is in the pool together. You kind of don't know what else is in the pool, but it's all there together. And this is your private cloud. It's all clean and clear. I get it. It's aimed at the audience. I really now understand the difference between the two. And so that to me is communication which is human to human and personalized and in a clear language. So just to close, I want to say, look, I think we are entering a new era of communication. We can see some examples and some really great examples of where government and private companies have changed people's behavior. And I think it's really down to three key things which you can do, starting this afternoon or tomorrow in terms of some of your communication, whether communication is part of your job or whether it's just something you do on a day-to-day basis. And that would be, number one, is the personalization, putting something of yourself in the message. Number two is the peer pressure angle. How can you make a behavior socially accepted behavior? How can you make changing a way of doing something part of the social norm, like the time zones or the towel competition? And part three is really around the persuasion and the human-to-human angle. If you can find ways of avoiding the corporate jargon, if you can speak to your audience as one human being to another, one person to another person, that's really much more powerful than supplying the cloak of organizational jargon. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. Στη συνέχεια, παρακαλώ τον κύριο Μάικ Σιμόπουλο, Διευθυντή Κέντρου Κοινοτικών Μέσων Επικοινωνίας Κύπρου, να έρθει στο βήμα για την ομιλία του με θέμα «Η Άλλη επικοινωνία. Μη κυβερνητικοί φορείς ως μεσολαβητές μεταξύ πολιτών και κράτους».
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak in English and I want to thank the organizers for putting me back in that difficult situation of where do I fit in? I'm half Cypriot and I'm half British, so I should feel really comfortable in this environment where it's organized by the Cyprus government and the British government. But I'm also in between two very highly distinguished English-speaking speakers. So I'm going to put on my best English accent to speak to you at this point. But it also relates to the topic of the presentation I'm talking about today, which is about non-state actors. And I've been thinking about the discussion between what do we mean by state and what do we mean by government. This has been a big discussion this morning. But whether we call them non-state actors or non-government actors, they still, what is their place? Where are they meant to exist? Particularly within this kind of complex communications environment. And I was listening this morning to Mr. Aiken, who was saying that communications is about unity. where I come from, communication is about diversity. It's not about, I mean, obviously I come from a completely different sector to the ones that most of you come from. But our communication is not a communication, it's about a unity of message. It's about a multiplicity of perspectives. It's about listening to different opinions. It's about being able to take all this information, and this is where the state and governments come into play, and try and digest it, try to figure out what are the issues that people are out there trying to say. So embrace the diversity, figure out what all these perspectives are. How do I try and integrate those into my policies? And I really do think this discussion about what is government and what is state is really prevalent in this country. We talked, there was a discussion this morning about what happened in March last year. We could go back to the discussion of what happened in July 2011, where we had a big crisis in Cyprus, and there the communications of the government at the time came into there's a big question marks about that communication. My personal perspective is that I don't think that a change of government would have made any difference. It was an extremely unfortunate event, but the fact of the matter is that whichever government was in power at that time, the decision-making process would have been exactly the same. And it would have led, unfortunately, to the catastrophe that happened, because the state processes that existed for that particular process were not put in place. So whatever criticism one can make of previous governments can also make of current governments, because the fact of the matter is that there is a state apparatus that is not put into practice. And also today I want to focus a little bit on the kind of social cultural functions of the media. We've been talking about, the politicians and state and government and, state and private media. But in actual fact, the media and the communications environment is so much more. There's a richness that's just not this, that we haven't really discussed today. It's about expressing identity, or multiple identities. It's not about just being one thing. It's not being Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot, woman, man, LGBT. It's so many different things. Reflecting the forms of diversity that exist within the environment we live in and the communications environment in general. It's about promoting civic participation. This, big question mark. How do we get people to participate? It's about enhancing social cohesion and integration. In Cyprus, we have a really big issue. We have a huge migration flows coming into the country, and we just don't know how to deal with it. At a societal level, at a government level, at a state level, how can communications help us bring these people closer to us? It's about holding freedom of expression and access to information. Cyprus is one of the few countries in Europe that does not have a specific access to information law, which makes it impossible for citizens to request information as and when they want it. This would be, if there's one thing to take away from today, is that we need an access to information law. And it's also about facilitating communications across communities, but also I'm going to play you an audio clip that I think is very, very pertinent. It's about communicating within societies, within communities. We have communities that are marginalized in this country and all around the world who need to communicate within themselves before they're able to communicate outwards. Now, the Cyprus media and communications environment, unfortunately, doesn't facilitate that. My friend Yorgos Perindaexis isn't here right now because he'll think that I'm contributing to the attack on Cyprus News Agency. But I wanted to show you an example of how, in practice, the Cyprus communications environment excludes people. So this is a decision of the Board of Directors from May last year, halting any free-of-charge transmission, publication by independent organizations, movements and groups, except the political parties and any organizations that are connected to them. Now, I don't know if this decision has been rescinded, but I think it speaks for itself. It's basically saying to people like me, the ladies in the front who spoke earlier, that actually you don't have a voice. We don't want to listen to you. I had this conversation with him in private. I authored an article about it, and basically the response I got, well, not everyone can say what they want to say. I think you'll all agree that that is the whole point of communications, that everyone should have the right to speak and have something to say. So this is just one small example of a state institution that is cutting people out of communications. A lot of the stuff has already been talked about, but there are significant barriers to entry. There are exclusionary mechanisms in place, whether they are formalized like this board decision, or whether they are editorial decisions, both state and private, that reduces the number of other communicators that I want to talk about from participating effectively in the public debates. And that exclusion damages our level of democracy. And unless we're able to put some kind of mechanisms in place where everyone is able to communicate through various channels, and is not just left to communicate through social media. Yes, social media is becoming a lot more important. But the fact of the matter is that most of the people here work in the mainstream media. And these are the people we're relying on mainly for our information. So who else communicates? I mean, obviously everyone communicates. That's fairly clear. But the people, and I'm speaking from a personal experience of working with groups who try to communicate. I put them into three groups in this case. I talk about the non-governmental organizations, which should be non-state in my opinion, the non-profit organizations. It was mentioned before and also in the discussion between the journalists, those dealing with arts and culture, gender and gender equality, environment, human rights, all these people who have a real voice, a real kind of position to take on issues within society. There are specific community groups, the LGBT community, who had this amazing manifestation of the gay pride in May last year, but I'm not sure if you've heard a discussion on mainstream media about issues affecting the LGBT community prior or since. And this group that we tend to, not even consider as being part of our society is third country nationals. At least this is how we term them this is how the government or the state decides to term them, as third country nationals, which includes these people that are seeking refuge in our country, such as refugees and asylum seekers. So these are some of the other people that are trying to communicate their message through the mainstream media. So the same way you probably haven't heard a discussion about LGBT issues since the Gay Pride March, have you ever heard a refugee or an asylum seeker being interviewed on TV, with subtitles obviously, because he or she probably won't be able to speak in Greek, about the issues that are affecting them? Our understanding, our communication is happening between us about other people who are in our own country, and they don't even have a voice to say what they want to say. So how do these people try to communicate? Well, again, speaking empirically, some of them are able to, and some of them are generally not able to. They take to the digital social media, which has removed some of these barriers that I was talking about before. It's transformed them from being consumers to actually producing and communicating themselves. There's an increasing number of people who are taking to the internet to communicate their activities. Facebook is great for telling people what you're going to do, inviting 1,000 people to your events and getting 50 people at the end of the day, but at least those 50 people you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. It's a greater sense that the message that you're trying to put out there is not being diluted or filtered through the mainstream media. In actual fact, in the Cyprus case, I don't know if some of you have heard of the term churnalism, which is churning out journalism. Now, the experience of monitoring the media from the perspective of the organizations I mentioned before is that when we put out a communication, usually in the form of a press release, it's published verbatim in the mainstream media. I'm not sure whether that's indicative of the fact that there's really, it's just to fill space. There's not really an interest in what I have to say. And we do see an involvement of an increasingly larger number of people in these kind of events, in these kind of activities that civil society is undertaking. And I think that's testament to the fact that these other communicators do have an important role to play in a modern democracy. I wanted to start with an example that's already been discussed, which is Magda Zinon's example of tweeting to Andreas Mavroyannis, the negotiator for the Greek Cypriot community at the negotiations. And this was just to illustrate the point that whereas if a formal letter or a formal invitation was sent to the diplomatic office of the president or to the person in question, there was the immediacy of tweeting to this person who is actively showing an interest. Let's be fair. I mean, we talked about public officials getting on social media. Andreas Mavroyannis has been maybe not so much now, but he was much more engaged due to his position. And a tweet led to a direct message, led to a commitment to come to an event to speak about gender equality in the peace process. So this is another way, this is how a civil society activist communicated directly with what we would call a decision maker and was able to influence him in some way to participate in an event, bringing him therefore closer to the audience that she is trying to reach. Some months back, the organization I represent participated in a project with the Cyprus University of Technology, speaking to third country nationals about their perception of being covered in the mainstream media. And I picked out some quotes just to give you an indication of how these people feel when they're being discussed in the media. Language, obviously, is something we haven't touched upon at all, what language we communicate in. It's only natural that the majority of media will be directed towards the major language community. But if we're not making any effort to put out some kind of information in different languages, then these kind of communities that feel so marginalized are never going to be able to be felt at home. And this directly affects government policies. Right? It directly affects integration policies of the Cyprus government. The Cypriot media is not helping them get the possibility to express their opinion. I mean, that's fairly obvious. I love this quote. Society, what we've seen in Cyprus, believes that this news is just for the Greeks. It doesn't concern you, Philemu. What do you care? What do you care about the social policies of the government? What do you care about the foreign policy choices of the government, which usually has to do with the immediate environment, don't forget. Middle East and North Africa region is mainly where Cyprus is now being extremely active. So then most of the people coming into our country are from Syria, with whom in the past we had a very strong relationship, but now obviously we don't. Palestine, who I'm not sure what kind of relationship we have with them. So I think that this is all relevant. I think it's all relevant to the discussion of policy making at the government level. And this is quite an indicative one. Discussing the financial crisis in 2013, the media were discussing and informing Cypriots and Russian citizens, obviously, because Russians have huge significant deposits in Cyprus and therefore we care about their money. While there were other communities that had deposits in Cyprus that the media just felt no obligation to inform them. I'm sure there were plenty of other non-Cypriots who had a lot of money in the Cyprus banks who would have been very, very keen to know what to do around that time. But there was obviously a privileging of the status of some over others. So again, people are again being excluded from the information and communication environment. And the third example I wanted to close with is, I don't want to overstate the point. This is a program that broadcasts on an online radio station. Again, part of this new digital media revolution. You don't need the airwaves, which apparently are saturated with radio stations, in order to spread your message. Over the Rainbow is a show that deals specifically with issues from the LGBT community in Cyprus. And this is, I did a scouring of their programs a couple of days ago to find a clip that most demonstrates for me what communication within means. So this is a community that is only now finding its voice, that is still trying to deal with its own issues and problems. And the people who run this program are completely amateurs. Okay, they have no journalistic experience, they have no media training, or they have the basic how to structure a program, how to run a console. But their main activity is to promote the issues that they want to put out. And I've picked out one small clip. It's about 1.5 minutes that I'd like to play for you, that I think for me demonstrates what communication is within communities. Because if you're trying to assert yourself within a society from which you feel marginalized, you have to be comfortable in what you feel and what you have to say. So if I can get a technical support just to do that. It's in Greek, so it's easier for us to follow.
Ηρέμησε και αμέσως το επόμενο μου βήμα έπιασε τον αδερφό μου τηλέφωνο για να μου δώσει κάποιο ψυχολόγο και έκλαια.
Sorry, technical issues.
Και λέω του είδατε.
Θα μας μιλήσουν για την δική τους εμπειρία, για τα δικά τους βιώματα, σε σχέση φυσικά με το πώς είναι στην Κύπρο του σήμερα και στην Κύπρο του χτες, να υπάρχει στην οικογένεια έναν γκέι παιδί, έναν γκέι αγόρι, έναν γκέι κορίτσι. Να ξεκινήσω με σένα, Λουτσιά, όχι για τίποτε άλλο, δεν έχουμε στερεότυπα πάμε, απλά εντάξει, επειδή είσαι πιο απέναντι μου. Πόσο νωρίς εγνώριζες ότι υπάρχει κάτι, τέλος πάντων, όσον αφορά το παιδί σου? Πόσο νωρίς ένιωθες ότι κάτι τρέχει εδώ, έχουμε ένα θέμα, ας πούμε?
Δεν θεωρήσα ουδέποτε ότι υπάρχει κάποιο θέμα. Από πολύ μικρή, από πάρα πολύ μικρή, ακόμα στον νηπιαγωγείο μου έλεγε «Μάμα, ο Θεός έκαμε λάθος που με έκαμε κοπέλα». Τις εξηγούς τη ρωτούσα γιατί, μου λέει δεν μπορούσε στην ηλικία το μωρό να πει ακριβώς γιατί, και εξηγούσα έτσι εγώ ότι εγώ που ήμουν μικρή, ήμουν αγοροκόριτσον, τη θεία σου, κάτι φυσιολογικό, που είσαι πιο δυναμική κτλ. Όταν ήταν 11,5 περίπου χρονών, είδα ότι το παιδί κάτι την απασχολούσε. Κάτι την βασάνιζε. Και της είπα, αγάπη μου, αν θέλεις να μιλήσουμε, αν σε απασχολεί κάτι, θα είμαι πάντα στη διάθεση σου. Και ήρθε στο δωμάτιο μου, έχω πολύ έντονα τη μνήμη, έκλαιε και μου λέει, μαμά, νομίζω είμαι γκέι.
Στα 11,5 της.
Εκείνη τη στιγμή, μέσα σε μερικά δευτερόλεπτα, έγιναν απίστευτες εκπτώσεις μέσα στο μυαλό μου, διότι ένιωσα το αίμα να πιένει στο κεφάλι μου, μετά να φεύγει από το πρόσωπο μου. Αμέσως σκέφτηκα το μωρό μου ότι υποφέρει, σκέφτηκα ότι πώς θα έχει να τραβήσει από την κοινωνία της Κύπρου, αλλά η μάμα μέσα μου απάντησε πολύ ήρεμα ότι, και πραγματικά εννοώ το, ότι δεν με ενδιαφέρει αν με ποιον θα είσαι ευτυχισμένη, με αγόρι ή με κορίτσι.
Power of radio, and I believe in the power of communication through radio, communication within. This to me this is a parent of someone whose child has just come out and told them that they're gay, and you can hear in her voice that she's still trying to deal with that fact. So her ability, the platform that she's been afforded through the digital media age to be able to talk about these issues to herself and to anyone else who's dealing with these issues out there, I think is hugely powerful. And I think that and again, there's policy issues related around supporting people, providing services for people who are going through these issues that just don't exist in the polity we live in. This is just a huge example for me of how digital media facilitates communication within and outside. Thank you for listening to that. And just to so just to highlight the relationship of all these things that I've talked about with the state, I think it does highlight deficiencies that exist in the communication between the state and its citizens, and I think it also highlights probably some of the lack of services that are being provided for people who need certain communication the most. It facilitates the dissemination and exchange of information about state services that do exist. For example, for non-Greek-speaking communities, it enables them to find out about social welfare provisions, about language courses, about things that we don't necessarily consider to be important in our everyday lives. It has the ability to deconstruct policies and complex issues that are usually discussed you know, in a highbrow discussion of 5 minutes, or in the case of radio in this country, 20 minutes between the journalist and the minister. That really has to stop. 20 minutes of discussion with the minister is just far too long. It amplifies the voices of those that the state chooses consciously and unconsciously to ignore. And as in the case of Mr. Mavrogiannis before, it brings public officials close to the general public that probably before you wouldn't have had the chance to hear. Before the title of this seminar was put together, there was the word disruptive being discussed, and it was pulled out. I hope I've been able to disrupt it a little bit right now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Simopoulos. I would now like to invite to the podium Mr. Robert Orchard, UK journalist, former BBC Political and Parliamentary correspondent, for his speech on the uneasy relationship between the media and politicians.
Just testing to make sure the microphone's working. I think I can hear myself. Can you hear me at the back? Thank you. Kalimera. Είμαι πολύ χαρούμενος που βρίσκω Μάικ πάλι στην Κύπρο, όπου πέρασα τον μήνα του μέλιτος, πριν από 30 χρόνια στην Πάφο. Θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά, γιατί μπορεί να είμαστε εδώ όλη την ημέρα. Well, to those very few of you who don't speak Greek, and given my accent, perhaps to those of you who do, what I said essentially was good morning, and it's lovely to be here in Cyprus again. A brief word about my background first. I started my journalistic career in a newspaper, and then I worked at Westminster for most of the past 30 years in journalism, most of it as a BBC political and then parliamentary correspondent. Now I'm freelance, so I no longer have to begin my remarks in the time-honoured fashion, but old habits die hard, so just let me say that the views I express here are purely my own, and they don't represent those of the BBC or any other individual or organisation. In keeping with what's gone before, I'll try to be a little controversial, and you'll have to excuse me if I use notes for my speech, if I read it virtually, bearing in mind the unfortunate experience of the leader of our opposition, Ed Miliband, the man who hopes to be Prime Minister in 6 months' time. He addressed the Labour Party conference, the highlight of the political year for the Labour Party last month, and forgot to mention the main issue in the British politics at the moment, which is the state of the economy. So I'll stick to my notes. So it's been an interesting and eventful career for me. Even before arriving at Westminster in my first job in journalism, I'd squeezed into a cramped courtroom of a small seaside town to watch as a rather gaunt-looking party leader and national figure, Jeremy Thorpe, who a few short years before had been in Downing Street discussing a possible coalition with the Prime Minister, was now being charged with conspiracy to murder. I should say he was eventually acquitted, just. I realised then that politics clearly wasn't all speeches, and question time took on a whole new meaning. I started specialising in reporting politics in 1984, a very long time ago, at the height of Margaret Thatcher's power, and one of the first stories I covered was the Brighton bomb, the most audacious plot to destroy the British government since Guy Fawkes some 400 years ago. The Provisional IRA had planted a bomb in the hotel where the Prime Minister and most of her cabinet was sleeping during the annual Conservative Party conference at the seaside. The massive explosion just before 3 in the morning failed. The Prime Minister survived unscathed, but it virtually destroyed the hotel, killed 5 people, and changed British politics forever. 6 years later, Mrs. Thatcher's own MPs succeeded in achieving what the IRA had failed to do by night, a political assassination in broad daylight, bringing down a Prime Minister who'd won them 3 elections. My job then was to follow John Major's election campaign to replace her at BBC Radio 4, which found me sitting on the road right outside Downing Street's famous front door as the ballot result was announced, and the man who was Mrs. Thatcher's favoured successor, although she didn't maintain that opinion very long, I think, emerged grinning sheepishly to the waiting media as Mrs. T watched largely unnoticed from an upstairs window. So I was privileged to have a front row seat at some of the most dramatic political events of the past 30 years. Now, the uneasy relationship between the media and politicians I spoke of. So what is this special relationship? How does it work? In Britain, at least. I can only speak of my experiences in British politics and the brief period I spent working in Brussels and Strasbourg reporting on the European Parliament. But I hope there may be some common ground with how that relationship works here in Cyprus, or perhaps how it ought to work, if both sides are to get the most out of it, while acknowledging one of the fundamental tenets for me of good political journalism. And that's where we come to my main title of this talk, Dogs and Lampposts. Now, there's some dispute over who first used this comparison, but less dispute in English-speaking countries, certainly, over what it means. I'm sure you can imagine, or if not, I'll explain to you afterwards individually. The good political journalist must always treat politicians with appropriate, wary respect, but strive to avoid becoming too close to those politicians, ministers, civil servants, or even, I'm sorry to have to tell many of you today, government press officers. There's an old joke, not about civil servants, I hasten to add, but about politicians in Britain, which rather shows the cynical nature of the press. How can you tell when a politician is lying? When his lips move. Now, the two species, politicians in government in all of its many forms on the one side, and media, by which I mean newspapers, broadcasters, and the newer online and social media, have many interests in common. And we can work very successfully and very honourably together. But the interests of the two, government and media, are not the same. The government in a democratic country, and the Republic of Cyprus, despite your unique and complex problems in a divided island, is clearly a democratic country, is of course interested in promoting the public good, as Alex Aiken said, the welfare of its citizens and the promotion of policies that will maintain and improve that. But any elected government has to persuade voters, or had to persuade them before it was elected, to support it, and not the other lot, the other parties who could have been running the country if people had voted differently. So the government has an interest in ensuring that the way it sees things continues to command public support. It has a vested interest in getting its message across and dismissing the idea that there might be another, equally valid, or perhaps more valid way of doing things. I'd sum that up by saying that what is in the government's interest isn't necessarily what's in the national interest. And here I take issue with one remark that Alex made, if I may. He stressed, obviously, the impartiality of the civil service, quite rightly. But he also said the coalition about the current government, the coalition want to build a strong economy and a fairer society. I think a lot of people who aren't in the Conservative Party would argue with whether the Conservatives really do want to build a fairer society. That's obviously what the Conservatives say. We're all in it together. I think one of the main thrusts of the Labour Party, and to a lesser extent the Liberal Democrats who are in coalition but will soon be fighting the election against the Tories, is that they would say that Conservative government, Conservative-led government, is not leading to a fairer society. So that's a question mark, I think. And also Alex, in his excellent presentation about what government information or communications department should be doing, didn't actually mention the poor old journalists on the other end of this and how they react to the excellent way he's streamlining and making the government information and communications department more important. I guess that's where I come in. And that's also where the opposition parties come in, if you live in a democratic society. But without the press and without the media, it's very hard for the opposition's view to reach the voters in the modern world. And I hope it's not claiming too much self-importance for my profession if I say that democracy can't really work without a vibrant, free press and media, where the decisions and policies of the government and its ministers can be questioned robustly if need be, and its conduct held up to detailed scrutiny. Now that can't happen if the specialist journalists reporting on your politics and your parliament are seen to be part of some cosy, exclusive club inhabited by politicians and by a select group of journalists. It can't happen if those journalists are relying exclusively or even primarily on a regular diet of government announcements and photo opportunities to fill their newspaper columns, their TV bulletins, and their online pages. Political journalists in the UK are, at Westminster, specialists. The best ones, like my former colleague, the BBC political editor Nick Robinson, do have very good contacts with politicians. They do take MPs and ministers to lunch sometimes, which from my experience was a very pleasant thing to be doing. And they do seek to develop a close relationship of trust with ministers and officials, which can benefit both sides. The politician, for example, can leak a story to the journalist that may put him in a good light or a rival in a bad light without the source of that story being revealed. And the journalist could have an exclusive, a scoop, though you rarely hear that word used these days, that will lead the front page of his paper or top his station's TV or radio bulletin. But the journalist should always keep in mind that that dog and that lamppost and what the dog does to the lamb. Most of them anyway. And politicians, you may like and respect politicians and have friends who are politicians, but as a journalist you need to remember that you might one day have to run a story that could theoretically end their career if you're doing your job properly and ethically. I could digress and talk about the British press obsession with sex scandals amongst our politicians, but that's for another day, I think. So the fact that you could theoretically end a politician's career is a sobering thought. But politicians in Britain know the rules, even if they probably don't expect them to apply in the UK, with many newspaper journalists working for one of our several major newspapers that openly support one of the two main parties, and most of them usually back the Conservative Party. Of course, Tony Blair did manage to buck that trend, winning the backing of Rupert Murdoch's hugely influential Sun newspaper when he won power in 1997, after wooing the Australian tycoon so sycophantically that it sickened and embarrassed many old-fashioned Labour supporters, and MPs, it should be said. Tony Blair began with a long honeymoon with the media, but ended up describing us as a feral beast that tears people and reputations to bits. And the advice Alistair Campbell, his director of communications, received from an American spin doctor was feed the beast. Feed that beast, give the press and the media something to write about, and they won't have the time to go off and look for other stories. I'll be interested in Alex's view on that afterwards. So who should be the young politicians, the young political journalist role model, from Britain at least? Journalists like Jeremy Paxman, John Humphreys, and Andrew Neil, three British journalistic Rottweilers who never cozy up to their interviewee, no matter how grand, or the more laid-back, cuddly approach of a David Frost or a Trevor McDonald. I'd certainly opt for the former, though I wouldn't go quite as far as Mr. Paxman, who famously summed up his approach to interviewing politicians as starting from the question, coined by one eminent journalist of a previous generation, as, "Why is this lying bastard lying to me?" But a more general, if cynical comment, and I'm afraid I'm giving you some cynical journalistic comments, the most important thing in politics for a journalist is sincerity. Once you can fake that, you can do anything. And there's an argument that the interviewer like Frost, who could lull his subject into feeling relaxed and comfortable, could sometimes get more revealing answers than a full frontal assault. Ministers and senior party spokesmen and women are nowadays so well drilled and trained and rehearsed to avoid answering an interviewer's difficult questions that too often interviews in the media descend into a game of predictable stonewalling. It gives politicians, I'm afraid, a bad name with the public for never answering the question and being slippery, but it gets them through to the next interview, and that's usually considered, I'm afraid, more important. Oh, and in passing, let me give you one of my own pet hates in political interviewing. When any journalist starts calling the politician by his or her first name, I know this coziness means we're unlikely to learn much that the politician doesn't want us to learn. For the viewer or listener at home, it just gives the impression again of that cozy, exclusive club we at Westminster are all part of. Now, I'll just mention very briefly an institution that symbolised some of the best and the worst of political reporting at Westminster, the parliamentary lobby. What used to be virtually a secret society like the Freemasons, with its own arcane rules and secret rituals, meeting in a room at Westminster that officially didn't exist, and exercising special privileges on extra access to MPs and ministers in parts of the Palace of Westminster where other more humble journalists were banned. I joined this band of brothers in 1984, and it really was a band of brothers. There were hardly any women members. I recently came across the book of secret rules of this secret society that used to troop into 10 Downing Street every morning at 11 o'clock to be harangued by Bernard Ingham, the voice of Mrs. Thatcher, or later by Alistair Campbell, who played the same role, if rather more thuggishly, for Tony Blair. The lobby had its own code of rules, or omerta. Anything heard on lobby terms was off the record, and while the information could be reported, the source must never be revealed. Stories in the press or on TV would inevitably hinge on phrases like, "I understand that the Prime Minister thinks," or "sources close to number 10," or the hardy perennial Downing Street sources. I'll give you an example from this priceless gem, now no longer in print, I think. Rule 9 of the lobby rules: don't talk about lobby meetings before or after they are held, especially in the presence of those not entitled to attend them. If outsiders appear to know something of the arrangements made by the lobby, do not confirm their conjecture. The lobby ruled for years, but it was roundly condemned by many journalists. If you saw a punch in the lobby, one famous exponent and former chairman of the lobby, Chris Moncrief, a sort of great figure, the rumpole of the press gallery in British culture. If you saw a punch-up going on between two MPs in the members' lobby, officially a lobby correspondent term said you couldn't report it because you hadn't seen that, because you weren't allowed to report it. Now, many newspapers have been critical, saying that it's bringing members of the press too close to the people they're meant to be scrutinising. One famous BBC journalist, Michael Cockerell, a critic of the lobby, described it as spaniel journalism. And its air of carefully cultivated mystique suffered from a number of disastrous failures to spot or report an important story. Going back to that fall of Mrs. Thatcher in 1990, not one member of these elite hacks in the lobby spotted cabinet minister after cabinet minister queuing up the night before in the Commons itself to tell Mrs. Thatcher she couldn't win and so should resign to stop her arch-enemy Michael Heseltine becoming Prime Minister. I know this because I was one of those lobby correspondents on duty that night. But to be fair to myself, I was a very junior member of the lobby at the time. Years later, the lobby failed to report for many years the widely known or suspected drink problem of the then Liberal Democrat leader, Charles Kennedy, who finally resigned under pressure from his own MPs. But the lobby was probably fatally undermined by the MP's expenses scandal in 2009. Again, its members were nowhere to be seen in questioning a long-standing abuse by MPs until extraordinary revelations, complete with jaw-dropping details of fraud, fake receipts, claims for ornamental duck houses and moat cleaning, which caused a sensation and public revulsion at MPs, which I'm afraid continues to this day. There are some other factors in the decline of the lobby, but they must wait for another time. So let's return briefly to my lament at the slipperiness of many politicians, their preference for avoiding a difficult question, even when this is quite blatant and obvious to the viewer or listener. Just consider for a moment, though, a rational, honourable politician who actually dared to express an opinion or go off script or admit his government had blundered or got something badly wrong. In short, to be refreshingly honest. Does he or she exist? Well, I can think of the Tory veteran Ken Clarke as an all-too-rare example at the top of government. And more Labour left-wingers, obviously, and Tory Europhobes, the 30 or 50 MPs who are leading David Cameron towards potential exit from the European Union. Surely the public are grown up enough, though, to be told the truth. That's not everything the government does is perfect. Who thinks it is? Things do go wrong all the time, but only rarely to the public, the voters, get the chance to be given the full facts and allowed to judge for themselves. So I disagree with an earlier speaker who said, well, you can, in the short term, you can maybe, I paraphrase, fool the public, but in the long term, you've got to be honest. I'm afraid, cynically, I don't think in the long term you do have to be honest, except perhaps when you're writing your memoirs 20 years later. So the good journalist will always remember that his or her first duty is to the reader or the listener or the viewer. It's not our job to make the government look good or infallible. In a fragile democracy where freedom might be under constant threat, that role might, in some circumstances, have to bend a little in the short term. But once the media becomes an arm of the government, something very unhealthy is happening. And government, freed from the watchful gaze of its press and broadcasting watchdog, there are lots of dog metaphors here, aren't there? Rottweilers, spaniels, and dog behaviour. They'll naturally behave differently through the reduction in scrutiny of the government's decisions and general conduct. In Britain in the last century, the tensions imposed when a government expected its press, and especially its media, to be loyal to that government, have only really resurfaced in times of war or emergency or in the long battle against the terrorism of the IRA. Going back to the general strike in 1926, Churchill, then a senior minister, lectured the BBC that there could be no equality, he said, between the fire and the fireman. And coming up to more modern times in 1982, during the Falklands War, Margaret Thatcher and many of her ministers and MPs were incensed that the BBC refused to allow its reporters and correspondents to talk about our troops, but insisted instead on British troops. At one key moment, as the British task force engaged the Argentinians, Mrs. Thatcher urged a questioning media to rejoice. But there was opposition to that military campaign, and that probably came closer to disaster than the public were ever allowed to know at the time. The strict controls, the censorship imposed on British reporters of the conflict made sure of that. And one of my own proudest journalistic moments was a backhanded compliment from the great Iron Lady herself, who responded to one of my polite inquiries with the words, I won't try and do the accent, your questions, whenever you have asked me, have always been on the downside. Now, I rather thought then, and still do 25 years later, that it's the downside where most of the useful journalistic answers tend to be found. So to recap, political journalists must keep their distance. They must not get too close to the politicians and ministers they're reporting. Of course they have interests in common, and a lot of information is shared for the mutual benefit of both. Simply on the Prime Minister's whereabouts, for example, or an advance tip-off of a significant policy announcement, so TV news can film appropriate pictures to illustrate the story. And the last the journalist or their editor wants is a barrage of different newsworthy government announcements on the same day. They can't all be covered, so news management can just mean releasing your government news in the way most likely to achieve the maximum coverage in the news media. The government grid that Alex spoke of. No one can seriously object to that. But too often these days, in Britain at least, I think, advanced briefing is merely used to get several bites of the same journalistic cherry. News of a minister's controversial speech, or maybe not that controversial, is briefed to selected journalists the night before, with selected quotes provided that will make the morning papers. Then the speech itself will be covered, probably live on the 24-hour news channels, which are usually desperate for anything resembling news, or at least something new. And thirdly, the speech will be reported after the event. And even if it then turns out to be something of a damp squib journalistically, a letdown, a disappointment, the chances are that the journalist will still give it a good showing, and the alternative is admitting that the story he or she puffed yesterday was actually just a piece of public relations smoke and mirrors. Now, news management has been honed to a fine art in the UK, certainly in the past, and it's to the credit of the government's media operation today that it often succeeds in focusing media attention where it wants that attention to be. But that should only be one relatively small element of the political journalist's work. So-called diary stories are often the journalist merely doing the government's job for it, in publicising what the government wants publicised. We need our own journalistic agenda, even if it requires rather less spoon-feeding and rather more journalistic digging. Of course, the squeeze on resources, job cuts in journalism, and the demands of 24-hour news, blogging, Twitter and so forth does make that a problem. Journalists don't have as much time to actually go out and get material, and that's true of domestic news and certainly more so of foreign news. Television's by far the most important medium through which people get their news. Some of the newspapers are still read by several million people, but voters still appear to trust the news they receive from TV far more, believing correctly in most cases, I'd argue, that it's less biased and fairer to all sides of an argument. Recognizing this, the main parties have, since at least the mid-1980s, sought to influence and, under New Labour, even control the broadcast media in our reporting of politics, and Labour politics as it was then. Peter Mandelson, the so-called Prince of Darkness, was the primary exponent of these black arts, and all the BBC's political correspondents of that era, including myself, bear the scars, or at least the vivid memories, of many a tongue-lashing from Labour's Director of Communications. The communications involved were usually the chillingly worded warnings that he, Mandelson, was a close friend of the BBC Director General and would have a quiet word in his ear if we didn't toe the line that he was peddling on that particular time, or choose the angle of the story that he considered the most important, even if we didn't. A colleague who was a senior radio news editor in the BBC recalls that in the 3 minutes it took him to walk back to the newsroom from the studio where the main morning news bulletin, the 8 o'clock bulletin, had been broadcast, by the time he got back, either Peter Mandelson or Tony Benn would be on the phone complaining about something. Now, Mandelson started a trend. He tried to crank up the pressure to quite ridiculous levels, which I think we usually manage to ignore. But it led to a culture which spread to the Conservative Party too, and I can vividly remember being Mandelson by his Tory equivalent one weekend when I was the duty TV political correspondent. I even had to inform our head of news, and within days, though, the Conservative Mini Mandelson was all smiles and inviting me to lunch. So I think it did pay, usually, to stand up to them. Now, my former boss tells me that little has changed in many ways. There's a daily tongue-lashing quite frequently of the news desks before or after the bulletins, not, I hasten to add, from Alex's independent government communications department, but from the parties themselves. They seem to have got into the habit now that you have to harangue the media. That's the only way you'll have any chance of persuading them. Now, I've ranged fairly widely over my chosen field and over a few hedges into neighbouring fields, and I've strayed at times quite far from my mythical lamppost. But I hope journalists facing some of the same problems that we do at Westminster will try to retain their journalistic scepticism, whatever the blandishments offered to them by government sources on or off the record. Be proud of your profession, I'd say, and its independence. We have a low status, it's generally accepted. Our profession is one of the lowest regarded of all in public opinion, but we can comfort ourselves that politicians are even less regarded and even lower status. So the job of the political correspondent, indeed most journalists now, is getting harder and more stressful with the relatively new demands not only of 24-hour news, but also of the need to blog and the pressure to appear on social media. In my view, none of these has yet made a major impact on political reporting in Britain, but in time, of course, they will. Online news is definitely the future. I would just say about social media, yes, it's becoming hugely important, but it's essentially the younger generation who are using it, and in cynical terms, again, young people don't vote. So I don't think it's yet really made a huge political impact in Britain. There's a temptation in a time of journalistic cutbacks and falling real wages not to rock the boat, to take that whatever official government sources deign to hand out and avoid offending powerful figures who may see you as merely there to promote what is, after all, often the government's propaganda, not the truth by any objective standard. Or perhaps, like so many good journalists in the UK, you work for a newspaper or a broadcasting organisation with a strongly opinionated politically point of view or owner. That makes it hard, obviously, very hard, to maintain journalistic objectivity. But you are there as the eyes and ears of the voters, and that's what gets most of us up in the morning. If you generally think the government is absolutely right, then you probably should be working as a press officer for Alex, not as a journalist. I'm intrigued this morning, there's been only, I think, one reference to the Turkish perspective on all this. And very humbly, as an outsider, I would look at the Northern Ireland parallel. It's not a close parallel, obviously, we didn't have an invasion. But after 30 years of rivalry, terrorism in our case, you ended up with some sort of settlement under Tony Blair's government. You had the extraordinary picture of Martin McGuinness, leader of the IRA, and in many people's view, an alleged terrorist and involved in all sorts of horrendous crimes in the past, linking up with the extreme Ulster Unionist Ian Paisley. They became known as the Chuckle Buddies, extraordinary political relationship. And this after 30 years of total animosity, total acrimony. So if that can happen in Great Britain, I would just hold the hope in the long term that something can happen from a greater rapprochement, a greater looking at views from outside the Greek community solely in the Republic of Cyprus. Going back to whether you should be a journalist or a press officer, even if you do switch sides, I'd hope you would never find yourself, and I end with this, and that no government press officer in Cyprus would ever find themselves heeding the notorious advice of one Labour ministerial advisor, Joe Moore, who on the 11th of September 2001, 9/11, just after both World Trade Center towers had been hit by terrorist attacks, sent an email to her departmental press office which read, "It's now a very good day to get out anything we want to bury." No self-respecting government, surely, should ever need to be hoping for a good day to bury bad news. Thank you, Evkaristo.